Albie hadn't expected much when he posted the advertisement on the colony's digital bulletin board. Farmhand needed. Hard work, fair pay, no experience necessary, simple, direct, the kind of thing that attracted drifters and desperate folks looking for a fresh start on the outer rim. Colonies, what he certainly hadn't expected was Nova. She arrived on a Thursday morning, limping down the dusty path that led to his homestead on Epsilon Ridge. Albie watched from the porch of his modest dwelling, coffee mug in hand, as the figure approached. Even from a distance, he could tell something was off. Her gait was uneven, favoring her left leg, and her silhouette seemed wrong somehow. As she drew closer, Albie's grip tightened on his mug. She wasn't human. Nova's skin had a faint iridescent quality, shifting between pale blue and silver in the morning light. Her eyes were larger than a human's, set slightly wider apart, with pupils that contracted to vertical slits against the rising sun. Two delicate antennae curved back from her temples, barely visible beneath the worn cap she wore. But it was the way she moved, that pronounced limp, that made Albie's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "You Albie-chan?" she asked, her voice carrying a melodic quality that seemed to resonate in his bones. "That's me," he replied cautiously. "You hear about the job? If you'll have me." Nova straightened her shoulders, meeting his gaze with quiet dignity despite the obvious pain in her stance. Albie should have said no. The colony had enough tension between humans and the various alien species that had settled here after the Concordat. Hiring a non-human would complicate things, bring unwanted attention. Besides, farm work was brutal. How could someone who could barely walk handle the physical demands? "Can you lift 50 pounds? He asked instead. Nova's antennae twitched. "I can do whatever needs doing." Something in her tone, pride mixed with desperation, reminded Albie of himself when he'd first arrived on Epsilon Ridge, running from a past that hurt too much to remember. He'd needed someone to take a chance on him once too. "Pay's not great," he warned. "Room and board included. Work starts at dawn." "I'll take it." That was 3 months ago. Albie learned quickly that Nova was worth 10 human farmhands. What she lacked in mobility, she made up for in ingenuity. She rigged a pulley system that cut their harvesting time in half. She identified a fungal infection in the grain fields that Albie had missed, saving the entire crop. Her people, she explained during their rare breaks, had been agriculturalists for millennia before humans even discovered fire. "We shaped entire worlds," she told him one evening, her voice distant with memory. They sat on the porch watching the binary sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and violet, turned barren rocks into gardens that fed billions. "What happened?" Albie asked, though he wasn't sure he had the right to pry. Nova's antennae drooped. "War. My world was in the wrong sector when the dissolution came. We were casualties, collateral damage in someone else's conflict." Her hand unconsciously moved to her injured leg. Albie had noticed she never talked about how she'd been hurt, never complained about the pain he could see etched in her face during the long workdays. "The limp," he said softly. "Is it from a collapsed building?" She interrupted. "I was trapped for 3 days before the human rescue teams arrived. They dug through rubble for civilians they had no obligation to save. Humans they'd never met, on a world they had no claim to." She turned to look at him, and in the fading light, her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "Your people didn't have to help. The dissolution wasn't your war. But they came anyway. Pulled me out. Set my leg badly, as it turned out, but they tried. Got me on a medical transport off-world." Albie felt something crack open in his chest. He'd spent so long thinking of himself as running away, hiding in the margins of civilized space. He'd never considered that humanity chaotic, violent, contradictory humanity might be the heroes in someone else's story. "Why here?" he asked. "Why farm work on a backwater colony?" Nova smiled, a gesture her species had apparently adopted from humans. "Because growing things is healing, and because I needed to believe that not everything beautiful has to end in ashes." The harvest season came, brutal and unrelenting. Albie watched Nova work herself to exhaustion, never complaining, always finding ways to contribute despite her limitations. The other farmers noticed too. Old Man Peterson, who'd grumbled about letting aliens take human jobs, started tipping his hat when Nova passed. The Hendersons invited her to their daughter's wedding on the last day of harvest. As they loaded the final transport, Albie found himself studying Nova's profile as she checked the manifest on her datapad. Somewhere along the way, she'd stopped being the alien he'd hired and become essential. The farmstead would run without her, technically, but the thought of it felt like contemplating a sky without stars. Nova, he said, surprising himself with the tremor in his voice. The contract's up next week. She looked up, antennae perking forward with sudden attention. I know, she said carefully. I'd like to offer you a partnership, equal share in the farm, legal co-ownership. The words tumbled out faster than he'd planned. I know it's not, this isn't. Yes, Nova interrupted, and the smile that spread across her face was radiant enough to shame both sons. I'd like that very much. They stood there in the amber light of late afternoon, human and alien, two refugees from different tragedies who'd found something neither had been looking for, home. Later, when people asked Albie how he'd ended up in partnership with a Valesian, he'd shrug and say he needed help with the farm. But in the quiet moments, watching Nova limp between the rows of golden grain she'd saved, he knew the truth. He'd posted an ad for a farmhand. The universe, in its infinite wisdom and strange mercy, had sent him something far more valuable, proof that humanity's greatest strength wasn't in their weapons or their ships, but in their stubborn, irrational refusal to leave anyone behind, even on worlds that weren't their own, even when it didn't make sense, even when it changed everything.